Hello, my name is Dr. Linda Reddy. I'm a school psychologist and a faculty member in the Graduate School of Applied and Professional Psychology here at Rutgers University. I have taught in the area of learning disabilities assessment, particularly for children and adolescents, and I'm delighted to be part of Understood's project and this chat.
Getting it in the headphone.
Lynn, do you want to spitball a bit while we?
Oh wait, now there you
Should
are.
you want me to say, I'll keep
Nope.
talking?
Nope. You know what? Everything seems to be working great now. For those of you who, we apologize for the technical issues. We are new to this, but we're learning through. So as I was saying, before we start, just a couple of housekeeping items about the chat. If you look to the right of your screen, you'll see a chat window. That's where you can ask questions of Linda, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. If you're comfortable with it, please tell us your name, where you're from, and how old the child you're asking about is. But if you'd like to ask anonymously, that's also completely okay. So to begin with, I'm going to ask Linda, do you mind giving us a brief description of some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today?
Sure. We're going to be talking about learning disabilities or disorders or learning difficulties. And we're also particularly talking about visual processing issues and auditory processing issues, which are related in part to some learning disabilities.
Great. So I'm going to start with a question that was asked on our Facebook page. Someone wants to know what's the difference between a processing disorder and a learning disability?
Sure, I'd be happy to answer that. A learning disability has been established by many national and international organizations as being a disorder that's distinct and separate to other disorders. Learning disabilities impact children's functioning in terms of learning and academic performances, and in some disorders can also impact social engagement. Processing issues are inherently related to a learning disability or another disorder, but are not distinct and separate. I want to make sure we're very clear. When we talk about visual processing and auditory processing, they are not necessarily distinct disorders in and of itself, but they can be processing issues or strengths that children or adults with learning disabilities may have. There is lack of consensus currently in the literature in the professional world on a visual processing disorder versus an auditory processing disorder. But we know they exist and they're very important.
Okay, great. Thanks. That was really interesting. Someone else on Twitter is asking, can you use medication for a processing issue?
Well, let me just define. There are many different processing issues, and I'm going to just focus on the visual versus auditory processing issue. At this time, there's no evidence that medications like stimulant medications and other medications can assist with visual or auditory processing issues. There are other types of interventions that can be helpful for children and adults.
Okay, great. One of our parents is asking. She thinks that her child has an auditory processing issue. How would she go about getting tested for that? What would the first steps
Excellent.
be?
Well, the first step is the child a school age child? And I ask this because there are many children who are showing language based difficulties. So the first place is if the child's a school age child, a good place for them first to go is to go to and write a memo and see if they could get some screening and evaluation done by speech and language therapists at their schools. Now, here's the thing that's very, very important. Um, Requesting an evaluation in the public schools does not mean you will receive evaluation. A child has to show functional impairments in their language processing in order for the school under IDEA, the Individual Disability Education Act, to warrant the school to provide those services, evaluation services. Okay, so if the child is not school age and is younger, that is a preschool age, what they can do is go through their insurance if they have it and go for an audiological referral evaluation. This is typically an evaluation that's done in a hospital setting. It's very child friendly, where they bring the child in and they test the child's receptive and expressive languages within an audiologist testing service. It's like being in a very big room with a black box. They could even test a child's hearing and auditory processing, even at the age of 2, very accurately with this type of testing.
Great. And would you say a similar method would be used for someone who thinks that their child might have a visual processing issue, or just be a different specialist?
It's a different specialist. An audiologist would be the first place I would go if it was my child with what I would suspect an audio processing issue. If I'm thinking my child has a visual processing issue, and by the way, that's again can be commonly diagnosed by first going to the optometrist. You would want to start there and having the child's vision tested, and then going to a specialist from there as well. In the event that the optometrist exam has identified some issues, one could then expand depending on the results and go to a neuropsychologist who would do more comprehensive testing on visual processing as well.
Okay, great. That's a really good distinction between the two issues. Now, someone's asking what kinds of therapies would be good for children with auditory processing issues.
Well, again, an auditory processing issue, again, is very routed and in the area of speech and language therapy. So if, in fact, somebody does have these difficulties, there are some pretty traditional audiology interventions that can be used. But again, it depends on what are the issues for the intervention to be tailored appropriately. So in this case, a child could also have formal and informal audiology training, which the child will be able to make some distinctions between the left and the right with their eyes closed. There is didactic listening tests. There's intensive also training that could be done for listening and auditory memory completion based on noise. There are many different interventions that are out there. Some of them are also computer-based. There's a program called Fast Forward, a computer-based intervention. And again, there's many out there that manipulates the rate and the intensity of various speech components. This program is game-based, which can be very engaging for kids to help improve auditory processing abilities. Again, this is a separate and distinct specialty area where I would encourage this parent to go see to an audiologist as well as a speech and language therapist in this area. But there are other devices and techniques that can be used that are computer-based and non-computer-based to help a child in this area.
Great, and I'll use that as a plug for some of the things we have on understood.org. We have a tool called Tech Finder, which depending on what the issues are, you can put in what your child struggles with, and we can recommend some apps or games or computer programs that might be beneficial. But that's the end of my plug. So we have a question from our community. It looks like a 38-year-old woman was recently diagnosed with auditory processing disorder. She wants to know basically what kind of accommodations employers need to make for adults who might be suffering from this condition.
Okay, so the first place I would start with this individual, this woman, is for her to know that my expertise is with children and adolescents. I'm very familiar with laws that govern children under Individual Disability Education Act, which is special education. But since she's an adult, her accommodations and her needs and rights fall under the American Disability Act, which is, again, a larger umbrella for this area. So the first thing I would ask her was if she's already been diagnosed. One was who's the professional who did the diagnosis, and that it was a report provided. If a report is provided, I would want to know what type of information or evaluation tests were used to diagnose her, and also what are the accommodations that are outlined by this professional. At that point, what she would need to do is, with her comfort level, is talk to that professional about the accommodations that she would need in a work-related setting. Now, all work-related settings are very different. It's very task specific and dependent. So she would need accommodations if she was a person that did computers, if she's a person that did sales. It all has to be tailored to what would work best for her. So with that said, I would recommend her talking to this professional and then seeing what would be best in the contexts in which they work. Then, if she's comfortable, she could provide the report to her employer for their consideration, which would go under their human HR department, human resources department, because there is a process and procedure for accommodations in the workforce.
Okay, great. And I think that that leads into the next question that was just asked on our Ustream channel. Someone says, my 8-year-old son was diagnosed with processing speed issues and working memory. Okay. Where in the categories of processing issues does this fall, or do they need to do more testing?
Well, this is a great question. I actually have done a lot of work with children with ADHD and ADHD-related disorders. ADHD is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. One of the hallmark parts of ADHD is working memory, and can be or may not be processing speed. Processing speed, I guess I'd have to talk to this parent, is do they see the processing speed issues coming up? Is it in their reading fluency? Is it in their mathematical computations, things like this? Because processing speed is very broad and it can be very specific depending on what the child's being asked to do. Some kids are great in reading fluency, that is the rate in which they read, and their processing speed issues don't come up there, but it may come up in their ability to write and reproduce things that they're seeing and also reading on paper. So processing speed is not visual and it's not auditory processing necessarily, but again, I would have to get more information from this parent.
Okay, well, we'll see if they want to put some more information in the box. If so, we can try to go a little bit deeper in that. We have a question from Kevin in Connecticut who says, what kind of accommodations can a parent request if their child has a visual processing disorder in the classroom?
Okay, the great question. So if in fact the child does have a visual processing disorder, it would depend on where the child is exhibiting these difficulties. Accommodations could be something as simple as this. Reducing the amount of visual stimuli, tasks, and word prompts on worksheets assigned to the child to reduce the distractions and the ability for the child to discriminate and sequence the work tasks that are provided to them. It could also be, again, I'm making up examples here because I don't know the details for this child, but it also could be providing some additional time for, if it's an older child, who has to write down things that are put on the blackboard or the smart board for them to reproduce. In this case, the child has to visually represent what they see on the board or the smart board. And then, of course, that includes motor planning and fine motor skills for them to reproduce it and write it down on a piece of paper. So one could be providing accommodations in the time to do that, or simply substituting that task, not having to write down what's on the board in the smart board, but providing the child some abbreviated notes to reduce their amount of visiting and reproducing things with their hands as well.
Okay, great. Someone asks in our on Ustream, so they have the same question as one of the previous, a similar question to one of the previous people. Is there another type of processing issues? They mentioned something called executive processing issues, in which the speed at which a child can absorb information or working memory is affected. And can you explain what, if so, can you explain what testing looks like for that? Is that the same issue, or does that kind of fall in another category?
Yes. Executive functioning is very similar to visual and auditory processing issues. We tend to see children with ADHD having executive functioning. This is the ability of the child to process information, encode it into their mind, and then reproduce it to use the information to execute an action plan, goal directed behavior. How would one test for executive functioning difficulties? By the way, this is not a disorder. This is a processing issue, like visual processing issues. These are not disorders. This is something that's associated with ADHD and other disorders as well. Executive functioning can be directly evaluated with neuropsychological testing that focuses in on how well a child discriminates and attends to information. On computer testing is other ways that can be done. Also, this type of executive function can be done with a whole host of manipulation tasks as well. Again, this is a neuropsychologist that one would go to for executive functioning testing and results for this area.
Okay, great. And I'll make another plug for some of the content we have on Understood. We have a lot of information on executive functioning issues. So this is if this is an issue that that your child might have, I highly recommend you go to understood.org, check out the executive functioning issues articles that we have. I think they could be of a lot of use. Back to the from Steph, one of the first questions who we got to a little bit before. The original question was about the processing speed issues, and we asked for a little bit more information, and she said he reads rather quickly but doesn't comprehend it well. He also doesn't write well, and was also diagnosed with childhood apraxia of speech. Does that change anything that you recommend, any of the recommendations or anything you said earlier?
Well, make sure I got that, Matt. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so this is the mother that asked originally about processing issues.
Yes.
And she's coming back and saying that her child can read well. That is, the rate of reading is good.
Yes, but the comprehension is low.
The ability to integrate what they read and making meaning out of what they read visually is difficult.
Yes.
And the other thing I heard you say, there was another piece that she added, that he's got apraxia issues, writing issues.
Yeah, she says he does not write well and was diagnosed with apraxia of speech.
Okay. So the question is, and I'm writing notes so that I could answer this best.
Certainly.
The question is, what is going on here?
Yes, I guess so.
Well, you know, for this parent, I just want to say that what you're describing to me is very common, where we see children having difficulties with a whole host of issues, and it's manifesting itself in a particular area or a number of areas. For example, a child who may be, I don't know the age of this child, who may be reflecting issues with reading comprehension, and then the output of that, writing issues, is not uncommon, because what we do visually is reading is totally a visual processing skill. The comprehension piece is an encoding and a memory integration skill. And the writing is an output skill, where we are able to take it all together and then produce something with our hands. So there's a number of issues that are going on here, potentially. Probably there's a number of strengths also that this child is exhibiting as well. In terms of, I would want to ask this parent if she's had a comprehensive evaluation for this child. I would also need to know the grade level of the child. But was she asking me about accommodations, Matt?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. The type of accommodations here are difficult to answer because of several things. One is, I would need to have much more detail on the age of the child, what has been provided for accommodations already, what is the child's full diagnoses. So I apologize, but I'm not going to be able to give anything with any specificity on this webinar for this answer. What I would suggest to her is focus on what the child is doing well in the areas of reading. We already know that the rate of reading, the speed of reading is good. and how one could accentuate on the child's strengths in the area of comprehension and or writing. In this case, one thing we could do if the child's very verbal is after they read a small passage to enhance his or her comprehension, the parent can engage in a brief talk aloud where the child could then talk about what they just read, even a paragraph. And then the parent can help write down their ideas and help organize their ideas, which then would create the next steps for helping them with writing as well.
I think those are great suggestions. Thanks so much. We have time for one more, and we had a question submitted that I think is probably on a lot of people's minds. Can auditory processing issues go away?
Well, with targeted and tailored interventions, yes, people's auditory processing can improve and can also be accommodated to certain contexts as well. So, what going away, I know that's something everybody wants with any type of disability. Again, an auditory processing issue is not a disability. It's an area that can be a competency that can be improved with targeted interventions depending on what it is.
All right, great. Well, I want to thank you for joining us for today's expert chat. For a complete list of all your chances to ask experts questions, please visit understood.org and go to the experts live section. Our next event will be tomorrow, September 30th at 7 o'clock p.m., where we'll be talking with Ginny Oswalt, a special education specialist, about ways to encourage learning at home. And if you can't make it, remember that all of our events will be archived on understood.org for you to view anytime. So I want to thank you, Linda, for joining us today.
Thank you.
And we'll see you soon on understood.org. Thanks very much.
Thank you.